This is part 3 of the Craftsman King Seeley 100 drill press conversion rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 2, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to be finishing the disassembly, cleaning parts, and polishing the column. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Continuing with disassembly, we're going to disassemble the Jacob's chuck. And to do this, I'm just going to use an old sleeve off a Jacob's chuck and a socket. I have the jaws extended about a ½ an inch out the front of the chuck, and that socket's just there to protect the jaws. And using a vise, I'm going to use one sleeve to press the other sleeve off the chuck. And just like that. Now we can remove both sleeves. And then we have the split nut, or the nut unit as Jacobs calls it. This one, the grease inside there is kind of solidified, so it's stuck. So I'm just going to use that screwdriver to pry it loose a little. And there's your split nut. And then we can pull out each one of the jaws individually. So you can push the other two down inside the chuck body and then just work out a single jaw at a time. There's 3 of them, so it's a piece of cake. Not a whole lot of parts to deal with here. And I have an entire video called the Chuck Omnibus that talks about how to install, remove, disassemble, reassemble, and all of that. And I'll put a link for it here. But that's the chuck disassembly. Next, we need to remove the motor data panel from the stator band. And I'm just using a drill bit here to drill out the center of these rivets, which will release the panel from the stator band. And there we go. So we're going to be fabricating a stator band for this motor because that one's in really bad shape. And that completed disassembly, so now we're going to be putting everything that's metal into simple green. So all of the castings and all of the parts that are metal. I've got a little mesh screen there, strainer, that I use to hold a lot of the small parts so I don't have to go fishing for them. And then we're going to fill this bucket up with simple green. And then we're going to let it sit for 24 hours. And this will remove almost all the grease and oil. And it will also remove paint. So if you don't want to remove your paint on any of your parts, then a soak for maybe an hour at most. And we're also going to soak the column. So this is a piece of 4-inch pipe, and I've got a cap on the end of it. We'll slide the pipe or the column in there. And then stand it up. And brace it against that column. And Just strap it down so it doesn't fall over. And then we'll fill that up with simple green as well. And like I said, we're going to let this sit for 24 hours. After that, we're going to remove all of those parts and we're going to rinse them off. This is pretty much what we've got left after they've been rinsed off. So next we're going to be putting stuff in citric acid, and all of those Zamek parts that are on the table, like the pulleys, anything that used to have chrome on it, any of that, it may look like it's aluminum, but it's actually Zamek, and it's going to get soaked in the citric acid, but only for an hour. All the other parts, they're going to soak for 24 hours. All the metal parts. So I use basically a shot glass per gallon or two of the citric acid, and I begin to mix it up. And once it's mixed up pretty well, I'll start putting parts in there and let it continue to fill up. The column also gets removed from the simple green, rinsed off, and then soaked in citric acid for 24 hours. So there's your base. So the citric acid is going to remove the rust. But like I said, any of the Zamek parts, you don't want to leave in citric acid for any period of time. It puts a weird film on them that I believe makes them brittle. So the steel and the cast iron parts, though, no problem at all. You can leave that stuff in citric acid for days on end if you need to. But 24 hours is about the time frame that I usually let stuff soak. And this is the separate bin that I'm going to put the Zamek parts in. I'm just making sure that that's filled up enough. And then we'll move the water over to the other bin. So you've got the spindle pulley, the motor pulley, the hub, the feed stop bracket, the feed tension knob, and the quill lock handle. So we're going to let all of that soak for 24 hours except for the Zamek stuff, and then we're going to pull it out, rinse it off, and towel dry it. So you can see the Zamek parts already on the table, and this is the rest of the parts. They're getting rinsed off, and then I'm towel drying them. And I'm also separating everything that's on the green towel is parts that is going to be painted, so it's not going to get any WD-40 on it. Now we're just putting WD-40 on these parts as a temporary right now so that they don't start to build up rust. But all of the stuff where I'm working now, it's not going to get any WD-40 because we're going to be painting those parts. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and clean up this table a little bit. So I'm going to use some WD-40, and I'm starting with an 80 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander. And I'm going to do 2 passes in each direction. And then 2 passes in this direction. And once I've done this 80 grit, then I'm going to use paper towels and get as much of that WD-40 off of there as I can. And once the WD-40 is off of the table, then everything else from that point forward is going to be just sanding, no WD-40, no wet sanding, nothing like that. So the WD-40 just sort of acts as a cutting fluid for that initial 80 grit. So like I said, get as much of it off of there as possible. And then we'll change the sanding disc. And we're going to do 80, 100, 120, 220, and then 320. And we'll stop at 320. So I think this is the final pass with the 320. And after we finish this pass, then I'm going to soak the table again in some simple green just to remove any of that WD-40 since it's going to get painted. So we'll soak it for a couple of hours in simple green, then we'll rinse it off, and then we'll towel dry it. And then we're done with working on the table for the time being. So next, I like painting the nose on the head casting. But the nose is not super defined as you get towards the bottom of the head. So I'm just going to use a file here and define that nose a little better. And then I'll smooth out that center ridge that's in the nose itself. And this will make masking it off and painting it a separate color easier. Now, I don't know why Craftsman didn't paint them two-tone, but I think they look better painted two-tone. So once we've got that cleaned up with the file, and my table keeps shaking on me, then I'm going to use a Scotch-Brite pad in my grinder to just clean that up and make it look all nice and neat. And then we can set the head aside and we're done working on it. So the next thing and the last thing we're going to be doing in this video is cleaning up the column. And I've got a couple of, almost all of my drill press videos, I do this with the columns. But basically I've got what I call a poor man's lathe going here. At the bottom right hand corner of the screen is just a cheap Harbor Freight drill, and I've got a threaded rod that's going all the way through the column, and then I've got some wooden table legs on each end and nuts that lock it all down, and then the column is resting on casters, so it's just spinning freely. And I dry sand it going all the way down the column and coming all the way back up with each one of these grits of sandpaper. So I'll use 100, 120, 220, and then 320. And that's all the dry sanding that I'm going to do. And at that point, the column has got a nice satin finish to it. So if you don't want to polish your column, that's just a good way to clean up the column. But I always want to polish them, so I wet sand, and I'll wet sand all the way down, going about 10 inches, and then getting more water on the sandpaper, and then going another 10 inches, and then continuing that process all the way down and all the way back with each grit. And I'll rinse the column off between grits. So I'm using 400, 600, 800, and then 1000 grit. All the way down and then all the way back. And yes, this gets very messy. And this is the 1000. We're coming back down towards the camera now. And the column looks really good at this point, even, just with the 1000 grit. But we're going to take it a step further. I always do. And when these columns were new, it was just a satin finish on them. They weren't polished or anything like that. So it's just what I like to do when I'm rebuilding drill presses. So then we'll rinse it one last time. And then we're going to dry the column off. And then we're going to be applying Mother's mag and aluminum polish. And look at the shine that's on that column now. And then once we get done buffing it with this Mother's mag and aluminum polish, it's going to look like chrome. So we'll just coat the entire column with this stuff. And then we're going to polish it off of there while the column is spinning. And you can do it with a microfiber towel. I'm using basically a ShamWow. I cut this stuff into strips. And you can see the shine already. But the final pass coming back down towards the camera is definitely the proof in the pudding. And this is basically the same process that I use for cleaning a lot of the parts as well, except in a smaller scale. But look at that shine on that column. Definitely has that chrome look to it. So because the column is made out of steel, it will rust if it's not protected. So once we've got it cleaned up and polished, we're going to disassemble this poor man's lathe and set the column on a towel. And we'll be applying Johnson's paste wax to it. So really any floor paste wax would be fine, because Johnson's doesn't make their paste wax anymore. But just apply it with a microfiber towel and then buff it off by hand. So we'll coat the entire column with the wax and then buff it. And that's the column. That's all we're going to do to it. So we'll Finish buffing it and we'll set it aside. But it turned out really well. I'm glad with how it looks. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. Video number 4 will be coming shortly. And we will continue with the cleaning of the parts and polishing as we go through the rest of the series. So, as always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.